Yes.
Okay, well, look, we'll get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tom Gibson. I'm the EU representative for the Committee to Protect Journalists. I'm delighted to be moderating this press conference around the launch of this year's annual report for the Council of Europe Journalist Safety Platform. It outlines some of the important trends and in context for the last year. And never has there been a more important time to have this comprehensive analysis and assessment. One of the esteemed panelists this morning talked about a tipping point. It feels like we're at a tipping point at the moment. Clearly, last year and at the very beginning of this year, we have been engaged in rigorously recording the range of threats that journalists continuously face. Now we're dealing with a new wave of censorship because of COVID-19. So it does feel that journalists are under pressure like never before. Let me explain how the press conference will work. We're shortly going to hear from our four speakers. This is an online meeting. We will have to organize this. Participants will be muted. We expect that you remain muted throughout the meeting. Please, thank you in advance, of course, for respecting this. Post the questions that you have in the chat. State exactly who you are, what organization or outlet or institution you work for. Write a question which is short and constructive. I also invite you to address the question to a particular panelist or say you would like the question for all of the panel to respond. After the presentations, I will then direct some of these questions to the panelists. We hope to do as many as possible. I apologize in advance if we cannot do all of them. The press conference will last until 12:30. And let me introduce our speakers. I also remind our speakers that once they have finished to pass the speaking on to the next. We'll start with Sarah Clarke, Head of Europe and the Central Asia team at Article 19. Scott Griffen, the Deputy Director at the International Press Institute. William Horsley, UK Chairman for the Association of European Journalists. And Ricardo Gutierrez, Secretary General for the European Federation of Journalists. So without any hesitation, I invite Sarah to take the floor and start the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, and good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to see so many of you online. Just for those of you who are not familiar with the platform, just to give a little bit of background, the platform for the safety of journalists of the Council of Europe is a group of 14 leading freedom of expression organizations and media freedom organizations who came together 5 years ago to create a mechanism within the Council of Europe to submit alerts on serious concerns around threats to media freedom. What's quite unique about the platform is that those alerts go directly to member states, and member states respond to those alerts, and there's a dialogue then between the NGOs and the member states. A year ago, we began to publish an annual report summarizing, as we see it, the main trends and threats to media freedom across the Council of Europe region. So this year's report reflects the findings from 2019, and the part that I'm going to look at is really the trends across the region that we've seen. We also have individual country chapters dealing with specific concerns in about 10 countries. So I'm not going to go into those in detail here. I'll mention some of those countries. But you'll see the link to the report is in the chat box, so feel free to read through it and then to raise any questions you might have with us in the Q&A. Okay, so just in summary, 2019 was a dangerous year for journalists in Europe at a time where their work is more important than ever. This report highlights 142 separate incidents of serious attacks, including the murders of Lyra McKee in Northern Ireland and Vadim Komarov in Ukraine. Impunity is now shielding the perpetrators of at least 22 cases of the killings of journalists in 8 countries. This year, we moved 2 cases to the impunity category, which is the category where we show that there is a lack of development, of serious development in securing justice. And these were the cases of Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta and Martin O'Hagan in Northern Ireland. By the end of the year, 105 journalists were in detention across the Council of Europe region. These were predominantly in Turkey, where there were 91 journalists in detention by the end of the year. I just wanted to flag that the situation of detained journalists has become increasingly dire in the coronavirus pandemic, and many of the NGOs involved in the platform have been pushing for the release of journalists, in particular in Turkey, though that to date has not been successful, and they've not been included in any of the easing of restrictions or the release of prisoners. 2019 saw a clear increase in politically motivated legal threats and judicial harassment across the region. So spurious prosecutions ranged from accusations of justifying terrorism to spreading false information, to pressures to reveal confidential sources. The case of Ivan Gulanov in Russia was a particularly well-documented case of these sort of spurious legal threats that are used to silence journalists. We also included for the first time as a focus issue the issue of SLAPs, so strategic litigation against public participation lawsuits, which are meritless legal actions by powerful individuals or companies that seek to intimidate journalists into dropping their work. So we saw these in France, in Belgium, in UK, and in Malta. We're also seeing a huge increase in political controls over information, which have grown tighter and more advanced by means of state and oligarchic ownership of the media, in particular in Hungary, Poland, Bulgaria, and Russia, where we also see a rise in political interference with public service media. And this has become a particularly important issue in the context of elections. So in Poland and Hungary, we've seen very serious interference with the media sector in ways that have secured significant advantages for ruling political parties in the context of elections. We also note the intrusive surveillance that's jeopardizing the protection of sources in Slovakia, France, Poland, and Switzerland. We have a section dedicated to freedom of expression online, which came under attack with alerts on Albania, Turkey, and Ukraine, highlighting judicial decisions, blocking access to news and information websites. And as you may know, Russia passed extremely repressive legislation in regard to online freedoms, so the sovereign internet law, which gave the regulator broad powers to control cross-border internet traffic. And separately, the Duma also passed legislation on fake news and disrespecting government officials. We wanted to highlight as well the particularly vulnerable situation that freelance journalists find themselves in. Both journalists who were murdered in 2019 were freelancers, and we're acutely aware of the increased vulnerability of freelancers who do not have the backing of a company and often struggle with issues around insurance and legal fees. Finally, we just wanted to reiterate this point of freedom of expression in the context of elections and the growing issue of attacks on journalists in the context of protests. So we've seen very, very serious infringements on Council of Europe standards concerning safeguards to ensure that elections are conducted free from political interference. We saw a large number of attacks on journalists in the context of elections, and also in the context of protests, where we saw excessive force used by the police, in particular in France, in the context of the Gilets jaunes protests. Finally, because this report looks closely at the agenda of European institutions, we saw some important developments. So in the Council of Europe, following the report of the Special Rapporteur Peter Omtzigt, a resolution demanded the establishment of an independent public inquiry into the assassination of Daphne Caruana Galizia. That inquiry was established finally in November 2019. However, none of the other recommendations from Peter Omtzigt's report have been implemented by the Maltese government. We also are concerned that we still see at least 10 cases of journalists pending before the European Court of Human Rights. They had been awarded priority status, but there's been a very serious delay in reaching decisions on their cases. So we really urge the court to make speedy rulings on their cases. Finally, we've been pleased to see that the EU is showing increased political will to defend press freedom in member states and to make them more accountable. So we've seen in particular Vice President Vera Jourova has used her mandate to strengthen press freedom with new initiatives on an EU-wide mechanism on democracy and the rule of law and fundamental rights. So that's a short summary, a short roundup of the trends that we're seeing. As I mentioned, there are also the country-specific chapters, so I'd really recommend you read those to get a better sense of individual country concerns. I'm now going to pass over to Scott Griffen from IPI, who's going to discuss some of the very serious concerns and developments in the context of the coronavirus crisis.
Yes, thanks a lot, Sarah, and good morning, everyone. From my side, representing the International Press Institute, based in Vienna, also one of the platform partners, and you'll see that this report was drafted, or it was drafted in January, and it was drafted on the basis of the alerts to the platform filed within 2019. So it was compiled at a time when no one could have predicted, or most people could not have predicted in January what was going to happen at this time. And for us, that means we needed to ensure that we also put the launch of this report in the context of the current situation around coronavirus and the effects on media freedom. And from our point of view, what we can already conclude is that there's a new assault on media freedom that is taking place amid the coronavirus, amid the COVID-19 pandemic, and this has worsened the already gloomy outlook that this report sets forth, and it underscores this warning that attacks on media must not become a new normal. What we've seen in the past few weeks is that the pattern of intimidation against journalists in Europe that took place last year has been accelerated by the pandemic. We see a wave of new serious threats and attacks on press freedom in several Council of Europe member states. We see states ostensibly, or as part of their reaction to the health crisis, detaining journalists for critical reporting, vastly expanding surveillance, and passing new laws to punish fake news, although they are the ones deciding what is allowable and what is false. So in our view, the situation has become even more serious as a result of the pandemic, and we see a real risk of a tipping point. Again, we have a very stark warning from the alerts from 2019, and we see a tipping point in the fight for media freedom, and also the risk of a paradigm shift when it comes to transparency and access to information. Over the past few weeks, we've already recorded around 52 cases of violations of media freedom related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And these are very often related to, in particular, legal pressure against journalists. And just to make a few of these examples more concrete, we have, of course, on the one side, the so-called fake news laws in countries like Hungary and Russia. And I think it's worth emphasizing that in Hungary, it goes far beyond even fake news itself, but also criminalizes distorted facts that can hinder the authorities' efforts to stop the pandemic. And I think in this case, we can speak very clearly of an effort to criminalize journalism. And it's also very important to underscore that we don't need arrests. We don't need prosecutions of journalists in places like Hungary to already have a serious impact on media freedom. The potential for self-censorship is enormous, and the damage is already done to a certain extent by the law itself. But we also see in several states bans on public authorities providing information to journalists, or bans on journalists reporting information that diverges from the government line, as we saw initially in the case of Armenia. In the case of Serbia, we saw measures restricting what public institutions can give to journalists. And this also is an example of making the work of journalists impossible, to scrutinize and continue to have a public debate about the virus and the impact, which is the role of the media, which is essential even in this serious health crisis. Unfortunately, we also are seeing arrests and detentions of journalists, in particular in countries where the jailing of journalists, unfortunately, is not uncommon, such as in the case of Turkey and Azerbaijan. In the case of Turkey, we've seen new arrests of journalists who were, for example, covering the situation, the preparedness of the healthcare sector for the virus, or covering the spread of the virus in prisons, where, of course, journalists have not benefited from the government's release of around 90,000 inmates on parole, which is cruel. And also in Azerbaijan, we've seen a number of arrests as well. In Serbia, we also had the arrest of a journalist who attempted to cover the situation inside hospitals to see whether they were prepared for the crisis. We also have seen the suspension in some cases of freedom of information deadlines, or at least their delay. Again, this, in our view, greatly contradicts the need for transparency in this situation. The media have a critical role in helping the public understand why decisions are being made on the basis of what data, and to be able to, where appropriate, build trust in the public for these types of emergency measures. Unfortunately, we also see efforts to ban or censor content. This has been especially a problem in Russia already, with the media regulator ordering the censorship of certain content, as in the case of Novaya Gazeta, for example, in recent weeks regarding the situation in Chechnya, but also in general increased powers by governments, to name a few, Moldova and Romania, to remove content that is allegedly fake news or spreading disinformation about the crisis. And this is occurring under the umbrella of this emergency laws, emergency decrees, which in many cases are themselves problematic, not providing sufficient constitutional guarantees, not providing exit strategies or sunset clauses in the case of Hungary, for example. But in general, there is a great risk that the emergency situation itself, or the health crisis, will be used to abuse and further restrict media under the cover of the health crisis. I think it's also worth mentioning, in addition to these legal threats, we also have we've also recorded a number of physical threats, physical attacks on journalists. We've seen this in Italy, we've seen it in Ukraine, we've seen it in Greece recently with a firebombing attack against a media outlet. We've also seen serious verbal attacks against journalists who are scrutinizing the crisis. This is, for example, the journalist Lasla Gaga in Slovenia. So all in all, we have a very serious situation, which again is accelerating the worst tendencies that we saw in 2019 and which are covered in detail in this report. And on the other hand, a rise in efforts by governments to scrutinize and to restrict what media are able to report about the crisis, and to really control the message, which is exactly the opposite of what we need right now. We need a free media to be able to cover in such a serious and delicate time, to understand what is going on, to understand the right path forward, and to understand the significance of these drastic restrictions on fundamental rights. I'm going to pass now over to my colleague William from the Association of European Journalists, who will speak more in detail about the emergency, about the situation of the emergency laws themselves and the need for strict proportionality in this area. Maybe just one final comment regarding COVID-19. Of course, surveillance is also a serious concern to us. This was mentioned already by Sarah in the context of the 2019 report. Obviously, there is the massive risk of increased surveillance, which has a serious impact on journalists' ability to protect their sources, and in general, the risk of a chilling effect. But I'd like to pass over now to William. Thank you.
Just before we pass on to William, can I remind everyone to please mute your microphone and also to post your questions in the group chat. Do post them, and then we'll get round to them once the presentations are finished. Sorry for the interruption, William, over to you. William, you're still muted.
Sorry for that. Thank you very much, Tom and Scott. Good morning, everybody. William Horsley here. I represent the Association of European Journalists, which is an independent network of journalists with national sections across Europe, interested in press freedom and the capacity of journalists to do their work, which of course is now under severe threat. I just like first, in a general sense, to remind you of the title of our annual report this time, that attacks on the media in Europe has not become a new normal. This is a great opportunity for us as members of this 14 organization platform to reach out for the first time really to all stakeholders, the institutions whose work we rely on to uphold press freedom, as well as all the national governments and, of course, the journalists themselves, who I think should know more about this work, the achievement of creating a Europe-wide press freedom alert system in cooperation with the Council of Europe, covering 47 member states, is a world first. Two general points first, because we looking to the institutions, we are addressing really the Council of Europe as the holder of the Convention on Human Rights, a treaty-based body, the European Union, which has until now said that it doesn't have much competence in this area, and that may change, and the OSCE, a consensus organization. I'd just like to point out generally that there is a paradox at work here. We have highlighted the fact of much of the media across Europe, but that includes the EU, coming increasingly into the hands of governments themselves and of their allies, business allies and oligarchs. So we have a situation where governments are not only the formal protectors of press freedom, they also represent the main threat. And this is true inside the EU and out. So my second preliminary point would be to ask the EU to be very conscious of this fact that the double standards applying to relations with countries outside the EU and member states must be removed. The EU member states must be equally strict about their own standards, and particularly the EU as a regulatory body has a responsibility to ensure the functional independence of media regulators, because we've seen everywhere how that has been brushed aside in many countries. Now, my two areas of focus are really the lawfulness and the allowable restrictions of the emergency laws, which have come across, been put in place almost everywhere. I just like to quote a eminent judge in the UK who's pointed out that the emergency laws, because of the health emergency, have effectively removed the fundamental rights of assembly and association, which are regarded as fundamental human rights almost at a stroke. We rely on the vigilance of the national governments, but also of international institutions, to ensure that the sweeping powers that have been taken are not uncontrolled, are not unlimited. It's important for the media community and all concerned to understand the limits on the powers that governments can take. And the Council of Europe has put out excellent guidelines on that, which deserve to be more widely known. Now, in concrete terms, two European countries, Hungary and Poland, as my colleagues have said, are particularly affected because this media capture process has advanced so far. And what this must be of special concern to the EU, that in Hungary, where something like 80% of all the media are in the hands of the government directly or its allies, now we have a situation where the emergency laws cannot be challenged by Parliament or by independent media. And more than that, there is a campaign of hatred and hostility to those independent media who remain. So the fear is that in countries like Hungary, we will see that the powers taken in the emergency laws may become permanent. We have a precedent for this in both France and Turkey. There have been states of emergency declared in recent years, and in both cases the laws were retained, although they were embedded in new laws, but they were retained. So that is an enormous danger which the institutions need to guard against. In Poland, we have elections coming up where effectively much of the country, much of the population really only has access or depends mainly for its news on the public service broadcaster, which is solidly in the hands of government and which openly vilifies and denigrates the opposition. This makes a free and fair election extremely difficult. This is also a question of independent regulators, but also an issue for the institutions. So just looking at media capture and what can be done, I think we hope very much with the EU taking an active interest that they will focus on their area of specialty, which is media regulation and the independence of media regulation to stop political interference. In particular, the Council of Europe has put out its own guidelines, 2016 Committee of Ministers recommendation, which talks about appropriate restrictions on politicians and public officials owning and directing media, as well as, of course, controlling the monopolies and concentration of media ownership and transparency. So functional independence of the regulators is absolutely key area. But I think our main message here is that this issue of press freedom is no longer a special interest. This is now a mainstream issue on which the future of the whole of Europe depends. And so we look to all the institutions and hope that our report will contribute to a wider understanding and a more determined response by all those institutions involved. Thank you, Tom.
Ricardo, you're muted. Yeah.
Now it's okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Ricardo Gutierrez. I'm representing the European Federation of Journalists, which is the representative organization for journalists in Europe. We represent over 300,000 journalists in Europe. I would like to say some words on behalf of these journalists. I'd like to focus on their situation on the ground. Well, we all agree on that. There is no press freedom without decent working conditions for journalists. And we all know that the pandemic has caused a collapse in media advertising revenues. So today, thousands of staff journalists are under temporary unemployment schemes. Many more are working for reduced pay, and tens of thousands of freelancers are totally deprived of income. We believe that local media, some local media, will simply disappear. We are going to see the emergence of geographical areas in Europe that are no longer covered by journalists. And that's already happening in the United States. So this is the great paradox of this particular moment. At a time when citizens need journalists more than ever before, these journalists are working in increasingly precarious conditions. Citizens should rely on journalists to expose misinformation, to provide clarity on the fight against the pandemic, to hold public authorities to account as well. But these journalists are no longer in a position to meet the public's expectations. We believe at the EFJ that COVID-19 is spawning a global press freedom crackdown through this devastating social and economic impact. We believe that public authorities should take action urgently. We need emergency recovery packages to protect the jobs of journalists and media workers, to support companies, and to fund public service media as well through this crisis. Governments must consider the media sector as a vital one, because journalism can save lives. The media sector needs governments to provide support by taking extraordinary measures. That could be increased funding for public service media, direct financial support to newsrooms to maintain journalists, reporters on the ground, direct subsidies, no interest business loans, tax credits, households tax credits as well for paid subscription to local news. Many forms of financial support. It would be interesting to launch public funded foundations to invest in new approaches to news gathering, specifically at local level. Well, I'll be brief. I'll just conclude by reminding that providing decent working conditions for journalists means ensuring citizens' access to independent and reliable information. Thank you for your attention. I'll be happy to answer to any questions.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. And thanks also for everyone's respect of putting questions in the group chat and that system. We already have 2 questions. I would like to remind people that now is the time for posting your questions, and also to invite people to direct the question to particular members of the panel, because obviously asking for people to respond on each of the questions could take a while. So I will take it on myself as moderator to actually divide the panel's responses in terms of the questions that we've already received. Peter Norman, Meeting Secretary AJ UK, has said, how far is the platform reaching out to organisations outside of Europe for added backing? I'm thinking in particular of the USA, where Donald Trump is subjecting the mainstream media to almost daily attack. I would like to put that question to Sarah and William. And then Otmar Lachodinsky, the president of AJ, a president of AHA, has said, Corona crisis means financial problems for publishers. Some countries started aid programs. In Austria, the government decided a special aid for newspapers and magazines, but the amount of aid depends on printed copies. So tabloids and even papers given for free cash, the bulk of it. Is that in line with EU competition rules? And I would like to put that question to both Ricardo and Scott. So Sarah and William, can we look at that first question?
Yeah, so I suppose in terms of the reach of the platform outside of Europe, it is very much focused on the Council of Europe region, and in that sense, it's unique and is a model that we would love to see replicated in other regional mechanisms, so in Latin America and Africa and elsewhere, because the platform has worked very well. Now, in terms of the US angle, many of the members of the platform have US presence, so CPJ, which is headquartered in the US, RSF, Article 19, many of our organizations have US-based offices, so we would be feeding in very often, across organizations into how to use the lessons that we've learned here in the US and vice versa. But in terms of really going wider than Europe, the platform itself is very much Council of Europe focused.
William, you're still on mute.
Thanks very much. William Horsley here. Well, as Sarah says, it is technically and practically limited to coverage of the European area, 47 states, but it is a model for others and has been taken up. It's seen as a model in UNESCO and other international bodies. There have been expressions of interest elsewhere, for example, the African Union, which is interested to see how it's done. I think it's important to say that the standards and the actual practice of this, the standards of the Council of Europe and the practice of the platform are themselves, can be a model for the issue of monitoring and reporting of attacks on the media, including killings, which is one of the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN agreed by every member state of the UN. So in that sense, it's already a model. It is actually being used as an example by an academic and journalism cooperation, collaborative work through UNESCO to see how it can be applied at a global level. So there is that possibility, but I do think that the experience of Europe is most significant by its having established this treaty-based system of protection of media freedom and freedom of expression and safety of journalists. And I think the Committee of Ministers, the executive body of the Council of Europe, has published their recommendation on the safety of journalists and protection of journalism in 2016. And that does deserve to be more widely known in other regional bodies and also by journalists themselves, because one of the problems for defending the press is when media don't understand their rights, they don't have confidence in their own institutions or in their own police, but here is a model, just as the Secretary General's rulings and statements on the limited powers of states to take, under emergency laws, that the limitations on freedom of expression and press freedom must be limited and controlled and should not become permanent. In all those ways, I think the platform is a useful reference point and perhaps a future model for others.
Scott, I invite you to answer the second question. Thanks.
Yeah, I think the second question raises a number of points. There is a specific case in Austria which the government provided financial support on the basis of a metric which I don't understand, the basis of printed copies without giving any reference to quality instead of quantity, and the metric itself of printed copies that doesn't make sense. But I think it's a larger question of how to address this crisis, and I see another question of a potential paradox between pushing for state support of media, but also worried about media capture and control. I think yes, there is at least on the surface a kind of paradox. I think it's very clear that the media, the situation of the financial situation of media is extremely serious, especially in places where the media were under pressure before. If you look to Hungary or other places in Central Europe, there is a real risk that independent media won't exist after this crisis. And for that reason alone, we have been pushing for funding to be made available for media as soon as possible, including from public sources. The question is, of course, how to ensure that those public sources are not abused to strengthen media, to strengthen state control over the media. Both, if you want, national level schemes as well as European level schemes with funding coming, for example, from the Commission or the Union itself. It's a very delicate issue, and of course it all comes down in the end to whether you can set up a system that guarantees independence in the distribution of funding, however this is set up, as well as having safeguards to ensure the absolute editorial independence of any media that benefits from such schemes. I do think it's possible. I think there are ways to do this. We have, for example, IPI has our own funding program for cross-border investigative journalism, which is funded by the Commission, but uses a model that protects 100% the independence of those media that benefit from this, and which also includes core costs. There's an independent jury that decides on the way the funding is distributed. There are clear and transparent criteria on how decisions are taken, and in all cases you need an intermediary to carry out this work. It should never be the state itself or any kind of public body directly giving funds to media. So yes, there is a kind of paradox, and yes, I do see a danger, also a danger in increasing in general the dependence of media on public sources rather than audiences and rather than the market itself, if you want. However, I genuinely think we have a very serious emergency situation when it comes to funding right now, and I think we have to find ways to support media so that at the end of this crisis they still exist, especially in those countries, as I said, where the financial and political situation was already extremely serious. Ricardo, maybe you would like to add to that.
Yes, I fully agree, Scott. I believe that it's always possible to find, I would say, objective criteria to distribute subsidies. For example, the Danish government, and it was indeed supported by the opposition parties, so it's not just a decision from the government. It's a decision from the government, but supported by the opposition. So they decided to launch a recovery plan based, a media recovery plan, 24 million euros just for 2020. And it's based on they calculated the support for each media based on the decrease of advertisement income for any single media. So it's an objective, it's a pure economic criteria in that case. Sweden, it's a rather good plan as well, 18 million euros just for 2020 again. Media recovery plan based on support to distribution of copies. So again, every single media will benefit from it. And part of that's rather interesting, part of the subsidies will be allocated to media expanding the coverage to rural regions or regions not as well covered by the media. So it's a way to really support the public service function of the media, including private media. And if I can add something, we discussed the point because it was part of the question of the competition rules, and we discussed that point with the Vice President of the Commission, Vera Jourova, and she ensured that, of course, the Commission will support any recovery plan. As Scott said, there is an emergency situation right now, and she ensured they will not launch any competition against these kind of recovery plans.
Excellent. I do want to move on to other questions. However, I'm willing just to slightly break the rules now, because I think it's important that we also ask for an intervention from one of the Council of Europe platform partners, the European Broadcasters Union. Giacomo Mazzoni is online. Giacomo, if you would also like to make a quick comment, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. The question about the contradiction to ask for subsidies and while pretend to be independent, it's the main question for the public service that we raise to ourselves every day, because we receive money from the citizen and we are supposed to be independent from the government. And this, as you have said, is not the case all over the places. So is a battle that need to be, in which the citizen and the civil society organization need to be engaged every day in order to pretend from their government, from their parliament, that the conditions for independence are ensured, either for the public service, but also for, if there are mechanisms of subvention to the press, this have not to be attached to any condition and any way of influence them by the economic power or the political power. This is something, is a long time battle, but there are some important progress that has been achieved in the last years. For instance, the revision of the Audiovisual Media Directive that unfortunately is now dragging its feet because of the crisis of the coronavirus that blocks the parliaments. But I remember that by September, we are supposed to have improved in all the 27 legislation of the European Union, plus the neighboring countries, the independence of the regulators under a new perspective, more cogent and more tight. So I think that one of the main goals that we need to pursue as organizations that are interested in the freedom of expression is to ask and to pretend from the government that they implement this point as much as possible and in the best possible terms. If the regulatory authority proved to be independent by the government and by vested interest, then the independence could be achieved, not only for public service media, but as I said, even for mechanisms to protect journalists and journalism. The last point I want to mention is, I think that sometimes we lack of economic perspective. The money has not disappeared. The money that is lacking in the media sector has gone somewhere else, has gone to the internet platforms. So to try to pretend to fix a problem that has been created by a new situation in the market without touching this new reality in the market seems to me absurd. Just to remember what happened in previous experience. For instance, when the cinema sector went into troubles in Europe because the number of entries in the cinemas reduced, then the mechanism of funding the cinema has been enlarged to new entries in the market, like the advertising for television. This provoked some troubles, but then passed as a normal thing. So I don't see why we don't consider this perspective that, in my opinion, is the only way to have a durable and sustainable environment for media in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I do also remind people when they're putting questions to address the questions to people, and therefore it avoids me having to direct them. But I'm going to do that now because we've got lots of questions and I want to rush through them as quickly as we can. Ewan Grant has said and asked a question. He said, regarding the need for multilateral support, how much support is being received from the Council of Europe, OSCE, EU Commission and Parliament regarding the narrow and wide implications of the murder of Jan Kuciak and his fiancée in Slovakia? And Scott, I would like to ask you to respond to that question. Gergi has then asked, there seems that more governments are more than able to just ignore protests or report regarding press freedom concerns. What can be done to make sure that governments will be held accountable first and foremost regarding their contact in relation to media freedom? And William, I would like you to respond to that. Thank you. Scott, over to you.
Yes, thanks a lot. I think maybe in this context as well, it would be interesting to mention maybe the case of Malta, which I think has perhaps more implications when it comes to the role of these institutions than the murder in Slovakia, I would say. So if anyone from our side has any comments on that, it would be good. I think in the specific case of Slovakia, we have certainly seen a positive role by these institutions, by all of them, I would say, in pushing for first an investigation into the killing, and later into the trial itself. As you probably know, 5 suspects were indicted, and 2 have been convicted and sentenced. And having been in the courtroom myself on many occasions, I think there is a feeling that things are moving in the right direction. Although obviously the COVID situation will delay a final verdict in the case. But it is, on the whole, a more positive example after months and months of especially public pressure on the government, I would say, which is also one key difference, or one central difference to the situation in Malta, was that there was from the beginning much more pressure coming from, or a larger pressure, let's say, coming from the public, which helped drive the investigation in Slovakia. So on the whole, it is, although delayed, a hope that there can be success in the fight against impunity, that even very powerful individuals can face consequences, as in the case of Marian Kočner. Of course, it doesn't end there. The political implications still need to be investigated. The wider implications around the surveillance of journalists, which was carried out immediately prior to Jan and Martina's murder, need to be investigated. But I think thanks to the support from the European institutions, thanks to the mobilization of civil society in Slovakia, thanks to the role that NGOs have played, that we are at least seeing some success on the path toward preventing impunity in that case.
Thank you very much, Scott. And I think you're entirely correct. We also have to look at the murder case of Daphne Caruana Galizia. And Sarah, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to ask you to respond to that, if you could.
Yes, the institutions have played a key role in the advances in the investigation into the assassination of Daphne Caruana Galizia. I'd pick out in particular the work of Peter Umzicht, the PACE rapporteur, who really pushed forward an excellent report into the circumstances around her assassination, and in pushing for a resolution that the public inquiry, which is now going on, would be instituted. So I think his role has been crucial, as has the work of at the EU level. You know, we've seen Commissioner Jourova has taken a really serious interest in both the assassinations in Malta and Slovakia. the Rule of Law Working Group, Sophie and Feld, a number of really key MEPs have been determined to push forward. Something that we're looking at the moment is looking at increased cross-border police cooperation. So whether we could push for something like a joint international task force, which would enable numerous different police forces to join forces on the investigation in Malta, because there are huge cross-border implications, especially around money laundering, to do with that case, that we need to go beyond the Maltese police force itself. But I think those two cases are crucial in that they've spurred the institutions into action. They've had to take press freedom so much more seriously, and we hope that we can see this as something that will prevent future assassinations.
Excellent, thank you. Let's move on to our second question, William. I invite you to take the floor. Do feel free to add any comments that you may have in relation to all those cases, but I do also want you to respond to Georgi's question about what can be done to make sure that governments will be held accountable and foremost in their conduction in relation to media freedom. So William, over to you.
Yes, I think we're all agreed, and the report emphasizes that an enormous step backwards has been taken on the basis of several years in which governments have sought to themselves deliver their message through captive media, through their oligarchic friends and so on, and to silence critical voices on the basis that national sovereignty reigns supreme. This is a fundamental challenge, and you have to remember that the framework that was put in place in the years after World War II was quite a miracle, whereby governments agreed that supranational rules would take precedence. That was both through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant that followed it, but also at the European level, where states agreed to submit themselves to a supranational court, the one in Strasbourg, to rule on these issues of fundamental rights, including press freedom. And all those rights, the watchdog rights of the press, were won that way, but they were done on the basis of a business model which was secure, both through public service media, television, but also through a wide variety, as we still have in the UK, for example, of privately owned media of diverse perspectives. What we've now seen, basically the Russian model, the countries of the post-communist countries of Europe have followed the Russian model, Mr. Putin's vertical of power, to remove checks and balances on the executive, including, of course, 30 or more killings of journalists in the years since the Putin regime began. And what we've seen now, in particularly acute way in places like Poland and Hungary, is that the governments there, the populist governments, have effectively taken control of large parts of the media themselves. So in fact, the enemy is within the gates. We also see in other ways governments in the past having attempted to discriminate, for example, to have press to provide information only to their friendly media. There was an issue of that kind in Austria. We see in Greece, for example, many countries there that oligarchs and wealthy people can simply set up media as a means to press their own case and to hire journalists to then attack their enemies. So that's why the watchdog role of the press has been so undermined. Even the Council of Europe's own assessment said that about 2/3 of all the countries in Europe, that's 47 countries, no longer have legal safeguards that are adequate for the protection of freedom of expression and journalists. So it's a rule of law question as well. But what I would stress is that how do the media keep hold power to account? The answer is that the journalists themselves, and I'd like to ask Ricardo to respond on this, in much of Europe, especially post-communist Europe, formerly communist Europe, you have trade union, journalist associations and unions. Some of them are legacy unions from the communist past, which tend to be loyal to their government, to the government, and the others are often independent, but they're less well funded, and they have been losing ground. And in a situation like in Hungary, where 80% of the media are effectively in the hands of one group, those who would be independent are really unable they lose the access to ask the questions. Now under the state of emergency laws, of course, real-time press conferences are not going. Several countries in Europe, the governments have restricted the public access to ministers and to officials. And then, as in Austria, the temptation is to restrict that information anyway to your friends and to vilify those who would criticize the government. So in this situation of polarization of the media community itself, very often you have journalists against journalists and oligarchs and politicians stirring up hatred and vilifying their enemies, using the media and refusing to be held accountable either by parliaments or by the media. So Ricardo, can I ask you to say something about how this could be addressed, given how pervasive it seems to be in some parts of Europe?
Yes, William. Well, it's rather easy for us to get our own view on media freedom issues, because in most of the countries we have several member organizations, sometimes unions, sometimes associations, and of course these organizations can have diverse political views or tradition or history, as you said. But we have one single common value, I would say, the value of journalism. And that's, as an example, I would mention the dialogue program we had between journalist organizations in Russia and Ukraine just after the conflict in 2014. So we were, as journalists, the only sector of civil society organizing that kind of dialogue. So it was possible for journalist organizations in Russia and Ukraine to discuss together. You know, it was not easy, of course, but we managed to convince them that journalists are not soldiers of the information war. We are just I got a call. Okay. We are supposed to serve the public interest. That's it. We had one motto for that project related to Russia and Ukraine, and it was 2 countries, 1 profession. We have one single profession and common values. So it's rather easy. Adding on what you said, William, I would say that one of the important points from the report is to show that press freedom is declining elsewhere, everywhere in Europe. You know, it's not. Before we used to focus on the usual suspects countries, you know, Turkey, Russia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, of course. Now with this report, we are able to point out problems in Western.
You've muted.
Violence against journalists in Italy. It was in 2019 report, 2018, sorry. And in this report, the violence against journalists in France, for example. So it's rather important, you know, to show a global view and a balanced one on media freedom issues in Europe. And that's one of the great achievements of this Council of Europe platform.
Excellent. We've got 5 questions left in 20 minutes, so I'm going to redirect these questions to panelists. And also, let's try and focus our answers within 2 minutes. And I do invite people to also post. I hope we have enough time to respond to your questions. I'm going to direct this question actually back to Ricardo. It's from Maria Laura Franciosi from Oxygenio. Talking about COVID-19, do you all have, I'm going to direct it to you, Ricardo. Do you have any idea of how many journalists have been affected by the pandemic because of their coverage of stories? I have heard of a few cases in Italy. Many journalists have been victimized and prevented from doing their work by authorities, police, and others. Do you think these stories will ever become public? And Ricardo, let me also, after you, invite Scott to respond to that question as well. Thanks.
So we are trying to assess the situation with our member unions and associations. It's ongoing, so I cannot give you a view. There are cases, of course. We are just collecting the data, so I cannot tell you more nowadays.
Yeah, I can't give much of a further response except to say that we are collecting the data on a daily basis about the situation, both on the Council of Europe platform as well as IPI has our own COVID-19 monitoring platform, which I'll share in the group chat, which is looking at attacks on the press globally in relation to the pandemic. And in both of these cases, as I see also there are a number of questions, Tom, related to how can certain incidents go on the platform? How do we make sure the platform and the organizations, while we are actively monitoring the press freedom situation, we also rely on information being sent to us to ensure that it is included and that it is given visibility. So in that sense, we are 14 organizations. If you are aware of press freedom violations, if you're aware of attacks on journalists, the first thing you need to do is communicate these. So let us know about them so that we in turn can alert the Council of Europe or give them a raise broader public awareness about that. So I would really encourage anyone who is doing monitoring at a very local or national level to do that. That is also what our organizations are here to do, to ensure that these alerts are given the international attention that they need.
Yes, indeed, reach out to us. The next question, Sarah, is for you. Lena Kush from the National Union of Journalists of Ukraine, the first secretary, she says, we observe increasing number of physical attacks against women journalists in Ukraine. Does the platform pay particular attention to this type of violence?
Yes, and thank you for that question, because we've also been monitoring the increase of physical attacks and online attacks against female journalists in Ukraine. So we do, of course, pay particular attention to we have 6 distinct categories of attacks. So physical attacks, and then online harassment and threats. And we do look at female journalists, but I think we could be doing more in terms of focusing on female journalists as a distinct group. And I think we could look to some of the work that is being done by IPI, by the OSCE representative and freedom of the media, specifically on this issue of safety of female journalists, in particular online, but also more widely. So thanks for your question, and I think it's something that we can take on board in the future reports of the council, of the platform. Thanks.
Excellent. Isaiah from Greece says, journalism is in danger. In addition to the threats against lives of journalists, there is a daily effort to silence the free press, which in its turn forces numerous journalists to be fired for trying to do their job the right way. How can we protect these people and stand up for their rights of free expression? Can the European Union help these journalists, and how? Isaiah, and you'll forgive me for probably pronouncing your name a little bit wrong, Isaiah Tassidou from the Association of European Journalists, Vice President for the Greek section. Ricardo, I invite you to respond to this question, if you could. You're muted, Ricardo.
Yeah, now it's okay. Well, I think that's what we are doing with the platform. I think the best way to react to threats on journalists is to make them public, you know, to make noise about them, to report these cases to the platform. You should know that the mechanism of the platforms allows member states to react, to answer to the alerts. Sometimes it's not the answer, but in any case, it pushes them to react. And the other thing is that that's a kind of name and shame mechanism. So for us, I was not convinced when we launched the platform 5 years ago about you know, the effectiveness of this mechanism, but I can tell you that it works. We see that when we report a case on the platform, it has an impact on national governments. They used to react, maybe not officially, but from our members at national level, we know that these alerts have an impact. So that's, I mean, the main point is to make noise about media freedom violations. The worst option would be to stay silent about it.
Absolutely. Well, look, we have a very practical question that it mentions EFJ, but I'm going to put it to William, actually. It's from Charlotte Michiels, legal advisor for the Flemish-Belgian Association of Journalists. She asks, what's the deadline to submit alerts to the platform in order to be processed for the annual report? Question with regards to next year. The Belgian-Flemish Association of Journalists has a local platform and would like to submit the alerts to the Council of Europe platform through EFJ. Thank you. So William, can you talk us through the process? You're muted, William.
Yes, we now have 14 partner organizations, and they all are Europe-wide. That's one of the criteria. Now, the reason that they don't include every local or regional, or even every national organization separately is just for management purposes. So 140 or more alerts a year obviously is not going to tell the whole story. We're very aware of that. Places like Italy, where the assaults or the threats in terms of libel cases and so on may amount to many hundreds every year, they can't all be done. But the process is pretty transparent, and we're very pleased with it. The Secretariat of the Council of Europe work very efficiently. They don't interfere. We are authorized to produce verified alerts on the platform, which are only checked to make sure that they are within the bounds of the Memorandum of Understanding, not for content. And then immediately those alerts are sent to the authorities in the country concerned requesting a response. Now, a response means a written response, first of all, to acknowledge it and to see what the government has to say about the alleged violation, which may be a physical attack, it may be a legal attack, it may be people in jail without reason, it may be killings. And we have got now a proportion of over half, but still not enough. Less than 2/3 of alerts are replied to by member states. I think it's true that the platform is not as comprehensive as it might be in terms of collecting the information. It's not as effective as it might be in terms of getting the alerts to the attention of the world, and the Council of Europe is doing a lot in that direction. We are representative organizations, and the way to get an alert on, if you're not a partner organization, would be to contact one of the partners. The details, I think, are all on the Council of Europe website, coe.int/FOM for freedom of media. And the capacity has been expanding, and the commitment of the Council of Europe has been really exemplary on this. The difficulty, as was suggested with the previous questions, is that when it gets to the national government, it's relatively hard to enforce the remedy of the alert. But the joy of the platform system is that it at least the complaint goes to the government very early. If you think that if you make a complaint to the European Court of Human Rights over a jailing of a journalist or whatever it might be, it's likely to take 5 or 6 years. Then you will have an established case law on which you can build a case for other people, but it's a very slow process. So here at least we have a dialogue going, and the platform is also in regular communication now with the Council of Europe to provide quarterly data for quarterly updates, which go straight to the ministers when they meet. In theory, they meet. These meetings should take place once every 3 months from now on. So that we regard as progress. But as of course the report shows very well, we do feel and we recognize that overall the situation is not getting better, it's getting worse. So we need collectively to find ways to amplify the noise and the complaints, the protests about these attacks, and also to get all the institutions I mentioned at the beginning, the EU, the Council of Europe, and the OSCE, to concentrate on enforcement and indeed on naming and shaming, on the business of peer pressure in order by governments to get this done, and not only rely on the poor journalists and others and other media workers across Europe who have to suffer from the governments very often being an oppressor and not a protector.
Excellent. We're going to be drawing to a close in 9 minutes' time. We have one more question, and then I'm also going to ask each of the panelists just to very quickly conclude with your key messages. Take no longer than 30 seconds. As we know, this discussion has been very interesting in terms of looking at what our role is as a press freedom community, in terms of documenting, building synergies, communication, and pushing for accountability, speaking out. Try and think about what your concluding remarks are to all the participants and journalists who are in this meeting now. But let's just go to the very last question, which is from Oliver at IPI. His question is: a parallel strategy for closing down coverage of the pandemic has been that governments have intimidated health workers who might talk to the press. What action can be addressed? What action can be taken to address this? I would invite Sarah. Let's go in order of the panel. Sarah, Scott, and then William and Ricardo. If you have any other points that you feel that Sarah and Scott have missed, do feel free, and then we'll move on to the concluding session. Concluding part of the session. Sarah, over to you.
Thanks for this really important question, and it goes to the heart of issues of transparency and access to information. So Oliver is absolutely right that we've seen across the region restrictions placed on health workers. Here in the UK, the NHS workers have been told not to speak to the press. And that poses, severe problems for access to information, which is clearly in the public interest. Article 19 is publishing next week a briefing on ensuring the public's right to know in the context of the pandemic. So looking at the importance of safeguarding access to information and transparency during this time, and we look in particular at public bodies, the need for full transparency, obviously from health ministries, but also from health workers. So I think it's really important that the issue is given the full attention that it deserves. So I think we need to be raising this a lot more as a vital access to information issue, and protecting health workers and giving them the support to speak out without fear of reprisal or recrimination. And then really pushing hard with ministries for health and ministries for information and justice, that this full access and full transparency is ensured.
I would just echo that in this country, in the UK in particular. I think there's a sense that the messages, the narrative coming out of the government and some of the public bodies responsible has been far from transparent and open. And there's an alternative narrative bubbling up. The Guardian is amplifying that and reporting many from the inside the health service, from inside the care homes and other places where they say that the plight that they have, for example, the health workers not having protective equipment, nearly 100 health workers having died in the coronavirus. Why is that possible? You know, there are these rival messages going on, and I think what it tells us in the media and journalism is that it's harder now, obviously with the lockdown, for whistleblowers and those with genuine complaints to speak out. It's absolutely vital that the institutions and the hospitals and the government do allow media access where possible within the social distancing level. But we did have a senior member of the judiciary here who complained that there is a real concern that the emergency powers, even in a place like the UK, would result in a police state. And of course, in a police state, there is no means for ordinary citizens to complain. So the stakes are huge, and this is a big test case.
Excellent. I don't know if Ricardo and Scott, if you would have anything else to add. In which case, we will move on to concluding remarks. Before we do that, I just want to flag that there is just one question that I didn't actually read out. I did feel that it was certainly dealt with by both Scott from IPI and also Giacomo from EBU, and that's a question of Roy Greenslade regarding the paradox, the funding and media capture paradox. I did feel, Roy, that has been dealt with, but do feel free, if you think that you may have more questions, just to message me, perhaps via Twitter after the session. And if you felt that we didn't fully go into the detail that the question deserved. Yes, exactly. Okay, fantastic. Okay, well, look, we are now going to conclude this session, but I do want to just pass it over to the panelists, and let's go in order of chronology again, just with your sort of 30-second concluding remarks. You know, let's think again about the participants. You know, what we need to do as a press freedom community, how we need to mobilise, the key messages that you feel people should be taking away at the end of this session. Sarah, over to you.
Thanks, Tom. I suppose the key messages are really that the situation for press freedom in Europe was already bad enough coming into 2020. It's been highly exacerbated by the COVID crisis. I think we need to be extremely wary of emergency measures. We know that once these powers have been handed over, it's very hard to get them back. So I think it's really important that we are scrutinizing extremely carefully the actions of governments in relation to the press and freedom of expression as they are passed, and not allowing the handing over of those powers unless they're subject to the safeguards and sunset clauses that are essential. Thank you.
Yeah, Tom, from my side, I would say, you know, we're living in a moment of great paradoxes or ironies, and I think we need to make clear what those are. The first for me is that media freedom has never been so important. as right now under the pandemic and the state of emergency, and yet it's never been under greater pressure, at least in past years and decades. Independent news has never been so important. Independent quality news has never been so sought after by the public, and yet media are facing an unprecedented financial crisis that could lead to the closure in many cases. And people need more information. They need access to information more than ever.
Excuse me, Scott, I just need to interrupt. Can everyone ensure that they are muted, please? Thank you. Sorry, Scott, continue.
No, and then the third is just, people need more information more than ever. And yet attempts to control the message and to control the narrative are growing. So I think our role needs to be to highlight these paradoxes or ironies, and to ensure that that we take steps to address them and underscore why media freedom, why independent journalism is so important right now, why it's not an enemy of efforts to control the pandemic, why asking questions isn't a threat. And unfortunately, we see trends heading in that direction. So that would be, for me, the concluding message.
William here. I would say that this question of how to direct support to media in their moment of survival crisis will highlight the issue of the funders sending money and support, practical support, to those parts of the media which are doing the watchdog role and not those which are simply defending the status quo. This is absolutely crucial. There have been mistakes in the past with the allocation of EU funds, much publicized in places like Serbia and the Balkans. That has, and Bulgaria, that has to be corrected when the Commission addresses this thing. My own feeling is, let's remember the triumphs of investigative journalism and the media in recent years, the Snowden exposés, the Panama Papers and so on, and the fantastic collaboration that has been possible. And at the end of the day, people everywhere will recognize the need for holding their governments to account. But in the short term, very often they feel dependent. They are dependent on the governments or the allies of governments, and so they're not willing to speak out. But our role is, above all, we've talked a lot about protecting the way that journalists gather information. It's vital, but also our role is to make sure that those journalists who are paying with sometimes with their life or with their freedom in jail in places like Turkey, that they get the support they need. And for that, we need to explain and provide the detail to the civil society. This has to be a joint effort to bring the reality to people despite the obstacles, and we have to keep the pressure up on governments.
Ricardo.
Yeah, very short. I think that as citizens, we all have the responsibility, the duty to protect media freedom, which is the right of every single citizen to access to reliable and independent information. So let's, as citizens, let's put pressure on governments. We need more transparency. We need full access to information. And we know that it's the best way to tackle misinformation, by the way. So as organizations, let's keep on feeding the platform in order to name and shame those not protecting enough media freedom.
Excellent. Well, I'm very happy that at the end of this session we can finish on those positive notes and remind ourselves of the strength of the platform. It is a unique accountability mechanism, and something that I do in Brussels and all of my other colleagues on the platform do around Europe and in Brussels is we do put this pressure on member states for developing their accountability and addressing violations of press freedom. And again, what we want with the responses is quality and quantity. And we do have very good solidarity as a press freedom community. And we have strength in numbers, and we need to continue to develop and work on that and build on our strength. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank the panelists. They really have been excellent. And also to thank you, the participants, because you've been very understanding of the system that we put in place. Thank you for putting your questions to us. If you have other questions, do feel free to reach out to us, either, as I said, using Twitter or contacting us via email. I'm sure you'll find ways of finding out how to reach us. And then again, with the annual report, obviously we've published today. Share that report, share it locally, share the findings. If you can quote the report, share it with your contacts. And do try and promote the work of the platform. Again, there's this unique accountability mechanism with those people who are around you in your daily work. But try and get them to be using it, try and get them to be aware of it. And also, let's try and work together to work out how we can actually increase the pressure on EU member states to respond, but to respond well, and in particular, to respond in a way which has an impact on the lives and works of of journalists. So look, thank you very much. We are now going to conclude. As I said, if you do have any questions, do reach out to us, but let me take this opportunity to thank you all once again, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.